very warm welcome to the chapel here at Pusey House. Still not too warm, we're still benefiting from the chapel's thick walls. It's a great pleasure to welcome today Professor Nigel Biggar to be our speaker in conversation with Dr. Jonathan Price, Bouverie Lay Academic Fellow here at Pusey House. I'll say a few words about of introduction first and a bit about the character of the day. Relevant for our talk today, Professor Biggar's first degree was in modern history. From this university, he studied modern history, or read modern history at Worcester College. During the 1990s, he was chaplain fellow of Oriel College, and then moved on to take the chair of theology at the University of Leeds, and from Leeds, chair of theology and ethics at Trinity College, Dublin. And almost 20 years ago, in 2007, he moved back to Oxford to become Regius Professor of Moral and Political Theology here, and he is the Emeritus Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology now. During that period, he was also a canon of Christ Church Cathedral, from which he retired last year. He's also the director of the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life here at the University of Oxford. And we are glad to be able to call him and have him as a distinguished scholar in residence here at Pusey House. I first came across his work when I moved back to Oxford in 2013. His book was published in defense of war, and I heard him speaking, launching or presenting that book, and was challenged by a very creative presentation of a form of just war theory, but the idea of the way in which ethic of love, or the claim of love, might lead one to defend those who are vulnerable or weak, and how that related to the way we thought about war, but also what he was saying about reconciliation and forgiveness. In 2017, Professor Biggar initiated a 5-year project entitled Ethics and Empire, and was perhaps surprised by how controversial that project became. And the final meeting of the project is this week. That has led to the production of his book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. I've also mentioned In Defense of War. In 2020, he published What's Wrong with Rights, treatments of rights theory and questions about that. And the book on Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning is still selling very well. Professor Biggar is involved in a project concerning free speech at universities, and also in his work, a lot of his work has that character of a commitment to public service and intellectual life. Before I introduce Dr. Price, I'll say a few words. So we'll have a talk from Professor Biggar, then Nigel will be in conversation with Jonathan Price, the Bouverie Lay Academic Fellow here at Pusey House. Jonathan oversees the academic life of the house and directs the Centre for Theology, Law and Culture here at Pusey House. We're going to send around a sign-up sheet. If any of you would like to receive any information about lectures and talks happening at Pusey House, please put down your email address. There'll also be a basket with a card reader in it, and Dr. Price was particularly distressed with me. I didn't mention this because he always tells us that we're rich in many things, but not financially, and you're very good at advocating that. One of the talks you would hear of if you were on our email list is the collegiate colloquium taking place tomorrow. There are a few spaces left for that, not many, but I'll say a couple of things about that. It's the final colloquium of the academic year entitled Dante and the Secularization of Politics. It's a one-day event hosted here, and the colloquium will consider the theological foundation of secularism, asking the question in what ways the supposed secularization of politics in Renaissance humanism was really a departure from the Augustinian paradigm. Well, I could say a lot more about that. Dante and the humanism about him. Some of the speakers are here today. They include Isabel Heinemann, Louise Davies, David Lloyd Dunster. Who else is speaking? Dominic Burbridge, Charles Foster. You are speaking, I think. That's taking place tomorrow here, so if you're interested, please send an email to pusey.conference@stx.ox.ac.uk. And since you won't remember that, why don't you speak to either Jonathan Price or Joe Ritzema sometime after this today. Thank you. And finally, as I'll mention one more thing that we haven't advertised yet. We just maybe put arrangements in place for a colloquium or mini conference on the life and thought of E.L. Maskell. Speakers will include Rowan Williams and Peter Webster, and that's taking place on the 8th and 9th of November. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for enduring that long list of notices. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. Professor Biggar, we're in your hands. Thank you.
So thank you, George, thank you, Jonathan, thank you, Pusey House, for allowing me this occasion to hawk my wares, and also for us to have a discussion about an important matter that we all know is highly topical right now. So I've been allotted about 20 minutes, and I will do two things in 20 minutes. First of all, I will explain why I wrote this book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, which was published in this country on the 2nd of February and in the US and Canada on the 5th of May. And then I will go straight to the conclusion of the book and summarise the main argument. So first of all, why did I write this book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning? There were three provocations. The first was in the autumn of 2015. I've been reading, although I've been a professional theologian and moral theologian for all of my career, my preferred reading has always been history, and I've been reading imperial history, British imperial history, for about 30 years. And so there I was in the autumn of 2015, and I was halfway through reading Robert Rothberg's yay thick standard biography of Cecil Rhodes. And then I caught word of the first stirrings of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign here in Oxford, and I noticed that some were claiming that Rhodes was South Africa's Hitler, and that Rhodes was a génocidaire, guilty of genocide. And I said to myself, neither of those things are true, historically. So the first provocation for writing this book was to tell what I regard as the whole truth about Britain's colonial past, reacting against what I regard as a distorted caricature that has become quite popular. But of course, there are many truths that one could choose to assert. There is a truth about the number of times the surname Biggar appears in the Chicago telephone directory. It's not a truth I would rouse myself to assert or even discover. So why did I bother about, why was I bothered about the truth about Britain's colonial past? Well, that's because the previous year, 2014, was the year when the campaign for the referendum on Scottish independence was held. And in spite of the way I sound to most Englishmen, I'm in fact Scottish, Anglo-Scottish, and I was then a visceral opponent of Scottish independence. But I felt it my duty to understand as best I could why it was that so many, in my view too many, of my fellow Scottish citizens were inclined to vote for independence. I was prepared to grant that maybe they were right and I was wrong. And so I read a number of nationalist justifications for Scottish independence, and I came across one argument, which can be summarised in the equation: Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, the reason that Scotland needs to break free from the United Kingdom is so that it can undergo a kind of moral catharsis and purify itself of the old, squalid, compromised, now weakened imperial and post-imperial Britain. And again I thought to myself, empire equals evil? Not so. Scrolling forward 6 years to 2020, George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis. The Black Lives Matter movement enjoys a surge in America. It crosses the Atlantic and it lands here. And it then propelled decolonization from the margins of Britain's universities into the centre and across many of our cultural institutions. And the story that the decolonization movement tells, I mean, decolonization means many things, but the central story is this, simply: Britain is systemically racist, and the core reason why we are systemically racist is because we continue to venerate our colonial past, which was essentially racist and was epitome of slavery. Therefore, we must repudiate our colonial past, pull down statues of Rhodes and others in order to exorcise, to expel from us our systemic racism. And again, I thought to myself, the two main assumptions of decolonization, the decolonization narrative, are not true. Now, I'm not an expert on race in Britain, but I can read. And I think there are substantial reasons to doubt that Britain is systemically racist. I know this is controversial, depends which newspaper you read. I've explained why I think this. I can refer you, of course, to the report of the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, chaired by Tony Sewell, a Black Briton, chairing a commission of, I think, 9 or 10 commissioners, 8 or 9 of which were not white. I can also refer you to a couple of books that received mentions in last weekend's Sunday newspapers, both by more or less Black Britons. Tomiwa Owolade's This Is Not America, and Rakib Ehsan's Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. I won't go further into why I doubt that Britain as a whole is systemically racist. I'm not saying, no one is saying that Britain doesn't contain elements of racism. No one is saying that no institution is free of institutional racism, simply saying Britain as a whole is not systemically racist. So that assumption of the central decolonizing story, I think, is false. And I also know the second assumption is false. The second assumption is Britain's colonial history is essentially racist and can be epitomized in slavery. That has to be false. Because for the second half of its existence, for the more recent half of the life of the British Empire, it was committed to abolishing slavery from Brazil to Malaysia on the largely Christian principle of the fundamental equality of all human beings, regardless of race and cultural development, in the eyes of God. So you can't simply identify the British Empire with slavery and the abhorrent racism that justified it. Anyway, so 3 reasons why I wrote this book. One, just the issue of the truth about the past, but strengthening that. 2 political reasons why getting the story of our imperial past is important. So here's my summary of the main argument. You'll find it in the conclusion of the book. If you want to understand the assumptions I make in the conclusion, I'm afraid you'll have to read the previous 8 chapters. So I start off by drawing up a list of the evils that the British Empire presided over. So no, I do not whitewash the British Empire. I really don't. And if you want to substantiate that, you'll have to read the book. Evils, but by evils I mean not only culpable injustices, I also mean tragic evils, which included, yes, brutal slavery, the epidemic spread of disease, failures to prevent famine, economic and social disruption, elements of racial alienation and racist contempt, policies of unnecessarily wholesale cultural suppression, the unjust eviction of natives from land by settlers, occasions when colonial governments were too weak to control settler abuse, instances of unjustifiable military aggression, miscarriages of justice, and the failure to admit native talent to the higher echelons of colonial government on terms of equality quickly enough to forestall the build-up of nationalist resentment. All those evils I regard as lamentable, and where culpable, they merit moral condemnation. So there's the debit ledger of the British Empire. But there is a credit column too. If the empire presided over the slave trade and slavery, it renounced both. It was among the first states in the world's history to abolish the slave trade and slavery. And then it led the world in suppressing slavery, as I said, from Brazil to Malaysia. In addition, the empire also moderated the impact of Western modernity upon very unmodern societies, promoted a worldwide free market that gave native producers and entrepreneurs economic opportunities, created regional peace by imposing an overarching imperial authority on multiple warring peoples, perforce involved representatives of native peoples in the lower level of government, sought to relieve the plight of the rural poor, provided a civil service and judiciary that was generally and extraordinarily incorrupt, developed public infrastructure, disseminated modern agricultural methods and medicine, brought up three of the most prosperous and liberal states now on earth, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, gave birth to two more, the United States and Israel, evolved into a loose, consensual, multiracial international organization, the Commonwealth of Nations, which some states that never belonged to the empire have opted to join, Mozambique 1995, Rwanda 2009. Inspired by the ideal of the Commonwealth, helped to plan and realize first the League of Nations and then the United Nations, through the wartime anti-fascist alliance of 1939-45, evolved into an important part of the post-war Western alliance against Soviet and Chinese communism, and still has a significant afterlife in the Western military alliance of NATO, the intelligence alliance of the Five Eyes, and influential economic development agencies such as the UK's CDC Group and the Department for International Development, now absorbed into the Foreign Office. Okay, so we've got evils and goods. The British Empire did good as well as bad. But did it do more bad than good, or more good than bad? My view is that that question is unanswerable. I'm often, well, for the last 6 years, I've been accused by some of my critics for adopting what they allege to be an outdated balance sheet approach to empire. And from the beginning I said, I don't believe you can do a utilitarian calculation. Because the goods and evils the empire caused, intentionally or not, are of such different kinds that you can't measure them against each other. They are incommensurable. How much chalk is worth so much cheese? How much racism is worth so much immunization against disease? How many unjustly killed people are worth the blessings of imperial imposed peace? How much humanitarian anti-slavery would make up for the evils of slavery? I think that just to ask those questions is to expose their absurdity. Such varied goods and evils can't be sensibly reduced to a common currency and then weighed against each other so we conclude that one set was more good than bad or vice versa. So that's the first step in my argument. The second is this. Given that all kinds of human rule, all states, national and imperial, produce a mixture of good and evil, even the Nazis built autobahns in Germany and the fascists made the trains run on time in Italy, does it follow, therefore, that the moral difference between them is only a matter of degree and that we can't judge any of them to be, all things considered, wrong? I don't think it does. I think what we can do is try to discern central values or principles that were consistently expressed and concordant goals that were earnestly pursued and realized more or less. If these values, principles and goals were gravely evil and immoral, then we can say that the rule of the state, the empire, was systemically unjust. But if it wasn't systemically unjust, then we can say it was systemically just, more or less. Now, the most obvious candidate for a systemically unjust regime, of course, is that of the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Dominated by the mind of one man, its view of the world was violently racist, and its aggressive expansionist nationalism unburdened by moral scruple. The death factories devoted to processing millions of Jews in the midst of the exigencies of war were not incidental to the regime. They expressed its resolute, crazed heart. So it is no accident that the contemporary enemies of European and especially British colonialism try to assimilate or identify it with Nazism, because then we can all be sure that it was basically essentially evil, notwithstanding all the colonial building of bridges and railways. Hence the claims of colonial genocide in 1820s Tasmania and 1890s Matabeleland, of racist callousness towards starving natives on the western plains of Canada in the 1880s, of crimes against humanity in 1897 Benin, and of concentration camps in South Africa and Kenya in the 1950s, and indeed of Cecil Rhodes as South Africa's Hitler. Moving in the same direction, if more subtly, are those historians who write of the racist or violent logic of British colonialism, implying that racism and racist violence consistently characterize its central driving force. However, my book shows, I can't explain here, you'll have to read it for yourselves, my book shows that it is entirely inappropriate to liken British colonialism to Nazism. Nor was it essentially racist or disproportionately violent. Nor, with due respect to Marxist critics, was it essentially exploitative. That's the second step in my argument. The third step is to add that from the early 19th century onwards, the empire included growing humanitarian concerns. First, the abolition of slavery, then the worldwide suppression of slavery, then concern to save natives from the ill effects of modernity and enable them to become equal citizens in new, modern Europeanized societies. My view is that when one people encounters another, and one people dominates in terms of power and number, only three results are possible. One is annihilation, the weaker people is annihilated, or there is separation, apartheid, or there is more or less assimilation. And my reading of British imperial history is that the goal of imperial colonial policy was never apartheid, never annihilation, always assimilation. and the full integration of natives into Europeanised society as equal citizens. Accordingly, in South Africa's Cape Colony, black Africans were granted the vote on the same terms as whites as early as 1853, 16 years before the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution. In New Zealand, all adult Maori males were granted the vote in 1867, and their native counterparts in eastern Canada were granted it in 1885. Unfortunately, about 10 years later, Wilfrid Laurier, the Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, removed the vote from the native Canadians because they were all voting Tory. I see your hand up. Can you keep it to a question, Simon? Thanks. The fourth step is to add that liberal traditions and institutions of free speech and political criticism gave the imperial system in general a built-in capacity for self-criticism. So writing in 1960, Lewis Gann and Peter Dijkman said, quote, "Future historians will necessarily draw on the material accumulated by commissions of inquiry, parliamentary debates, metropolitan blue books, and similar records, which form part of a self-corrective mechanism of a type unknown to earlier Matabele, Somali, or Arab conquerors. They played an important part in putting a stop to imperial abuses." Included in the liberal political vision, the liberal imperial political vision, was the good of self-government. Around 1820, all of the three major cities built up by the East India Company, Calcutta, Bombay and Madras, were governed by a Scotsman. And every one of them can be found to recognise that British rule in India would not be permanent and should aim to enable the native peoples of India to govern themselves decently enough and then withdraw with a good grace. One of them, John Malcolm, who was born, as it happens, about 60 miles east of where I was born in Scotland, wrote in 1823, I think he was addressing junior officers in the East India Company, "Let us therefore calmly proceed on a course of gradual improvement, and when our rule ceases, for cease it must, though probably at a remote period, as the natural consequence of our success in the diffusion of knowledge, we shall as a nation have the proud boast that we have preferred the civilization to the continued subjection of India." And partly because the empire was chastened by the loss of the American colonies in the 1780s, the idea that whatever form the empire was going to take could not involve tight control from the British centre grew, so that starting in 1867 with Canada and then proceeding to Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, by 1930 all those dominions were effectively independent, and from 1919 India was put on the same track. And it was in 1917 that Jan Smuts, I think, introduced the first time the term the Commonwealth of Nations. That was the fourth step of my argument. The fifth and final one is simply this, that the imperial centrality of the humanitarian and liberal impulses of the empire was made plain when in 1939 the empire committed itself to oppose the massively murderous racist regime in Nazi Germany, and especially when between May 1940 with the fall of France and June 41 with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the empire offered the only military resistance to Nazi Berlin, with the sole exception of Greece. So there, in a nutshell, leaving out all sorts of nuance,